Good afternoon and welcome to Israel Policy Forum's webinar, asking and hopefully answering, where do we go from here? My name is Susie Gelman and I'm the board chair of Israel Policy Forum. If you're new to Israel Policy Forum, I want to welcome you to today's conversation. Israel Policy Forum is a nonpartisan organization dedicated to advancing support for the two-state solution and for our shared vision of a Jewish, democratic, secure Israel at peace with her neighbors. We are proud to work with many policymakers, Jewish communal professionals, and leaders nationwide from diverse backgrounds. Almost exactly 3 years ago, we launched IPF Atid, which means future in Hebrew, to engage and involve leaders of the next generation in our work. Since then, our efforts have grown to include volunteer-led chapters in 6 different cities, with another 13 different communities represented in IPF Atid's Charles Bronfman Conveners Program. At a time of heightened polarization and shifting norms in U.S.-Israel affairs, young professional leaders are stepping up and rising to these challenges by committing themselves to an intellectual and nuanced approach to Israel, facilitating dialogues around complex Israel topics, initiating partnerships for our content to reach new audiences, and much, much more. Today's conversation is no exception. Amidst the COVID-19 pandemic that is unfortunately still raging in many parts of Israel and of course in our own country, we are now 4 weeks past the initial date set for the Knesset to move forward with the process of unilateral annexation of the West Bank. While the precise next steps remain unknown, although they will certainly be touched on in today's call, Israel Policy Forum will continue analyzing, educating, and opposing efforts that make 2 states for 2 peoples less viable, including formal and creeping annexation. Working with our strategic partners in Israel, Commanders for Israel Security, you can access a multiple of resources online at the Annexation Watch Project. Looking beyond the region itself, these dynamics have ramifications for the American Jewish community and U.S.-Israel affairs more broadly. Our speakers joining us today come from a variety of perspectives, and I'm proud that Israel Policy Forum can be a forum for civil discourse and debate about key topics affecting the future of our community. I'd like to briefly introduce our 3 speakers and then turn it over to the moderator of today's program. Elisheva Goldberg is the media director for the New Israel Fund and is a contributing writer for Jewish Currents magazine. She previously served as an advisor to Tzipi Livni, among other professional affiliations with different Israeli nonprofits. Rabbi Rachel Isaacs is the executive director of the Center for Small Town Jewish Life at Colby College, where she is also the Dorothy Bibi Levine Alfond Chair in Jewish Studies, teaching courses on Hebrew, Jewish theology, and Jewish humor. In 2016, she delivered the final Hanukkah benediction of the Obama administration at the White House. Rabbi Isaacs is also a 2018 Charles Bronfman Convener with IPF Atid, our premier leadership development program that is now accepting applicants for its 3rd cohort. Yair Rosenberg is a senior writer at Tablet magazine, where he covers the intersection of politics, culture, and religion. His work has also appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic, and many other media outlets. Moderating today's call is fellow Israel Policy Forum board member Jonathan Kamel, who also serves as the National Council Chair of IPF Atid. Jonathan helped launch the Chicago chapter and now works alongside dozens, if not hundreds, of IPF Atid lay leaders nationwide, in addition to his work with a number of other Jewish communal organizations. Professionally, Jonathan is the advanced TV lead in the Midwest for the streaming platform Tubi. To all of our supporters who are on today's call, thank you. And to those, we could not do all of this without you. And to those who have not yet supported our work, I encourage you to make a contribution. You can do so online at www.israelpolicyforum.org/giving. Whether you yourself are interested in IPF Atid, or you have someone you'd like to nominate to join IPF Atid, we'd be happy to distribute links for ways for people to become involved. Now, I'd like to hand it over to you, Jonathan, and thank you in advance to our wonderful panel for what I know will be a really interesting conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susie, and thank you to our speakers and attendees who are with us today. So to our panelists, we invited each of you here for a reason. You represent different segments of our community and our millennial generation. Obviously, we can't feature 100% of our community's perspectives on one panel. But as an organization, as Susie mentioned, we do hold ourselves to a high standard to showcase disparate viewpoints on the issues we're going to discuss today. I'd like to start by naming that it is healthy for us as individuals and as a community to have these deliberations on big topics like the future of Zionism, diaspora-Israel relations, and that it's okay to identify where we might disagree and agree with each other. I think there will be a healthy amount of disagreement on this panel, or at least I hope there will be. And I know none of you will hold back on sharing your views in transparency and honesty. That's why I'm particularly proud to be involved with Israel Policy Forum and IPF Atid, because of our commitment to intellectual integrity and forthrightness, which guides us to engage with many perspectives and the complex challenges that face us. For logistical things, you can pose a question for our Q&A, which will be asked after this moderated discussion. Please use the chat or the Q&A function below on Zoom. So to kick things off, it's been a fairly eventful summer, to say the least, disregarding everything COVID related, still the raging pandemic. We faced, the threat of unilateral annexation. It's still not over. And recently we've had multiple conversations, or this reemergence of the one state idea, debate, however you like to phrase that. So turning to you, we'll start with Rabbi Isaacs, and then we can go to the rest of the panelists. What are one or two key takeaways you're grappling with having experienced the debates over this past summer in the American Jewish community?
So I think I have two major takeaways personally, both of which are concerning to me personally. The first is the extent to which certain legacy Jewish organizations are willing to continue the work of Israel advocacy and try and continue business as usual, despite the unique threat that annexation poses, I believe, to the future of the Jewish state and the Jewish people. I was taken by Jason Isaacson at the American Jewish Committee, wrote an op-ed where he did lay out the problems that would come with annexation, but he said, the bottom line is we're going to continue advocating and making the cases of the current government in the international sphere. And it concerns me the extent to which our legacy organizations are not capable of saying we stand with our family in Israel, but we do need to be vocal about certain policies that I think can pose an existential threat to the form of Zionism that I support and I was raised to support. So I think that's very important to note, especially in the case of the American Jewish Committee. We just passed an important milestone, the 75th anniversary of the UN Charter, which the American Jewish Committee was very influential in the creation and the signing of that document. So we see legacy organizations with progressive roots that are willing to look the other way about certain issues that I think we need to have a more robust conversation about. The second thing that I'll say is that it's very clear that the overwhelming majority of the American Jewish community and the American Jewish establishment, the reform and conservative movements, are deeply opposed to annexation and potentially seeing the world's only Jewish state become an apartheid state. And that would be one of my worst fears, right, as a lover of Israel and Zion. And as much as our community, for the most part, is opposed to annexation, we haven't been particularly heard. I don't feel as though we are operating from a position of power. And we can have a larger discussion about how much power we should have in this conversation, which I think is a very rich place to have those kinds of conversations. But the overwhelming consensus in the American Jewish community is not playing a major role in Israeli decision-making. Thank you.
Yair, do you want to step in?
Oh, sure. So first of all, thank you all for being here. I am looking at just the sheer numbers of people who are tuning in to hear us talk about incredibly depressing topics, and I feel seen. So I have a takeaway that is actually similar to Rabbi Isaacs, but both it and its flip side. One is there is this sense of, I think, of Jewish powerlessness right now in the American Jewish community. And it doesn't just, by the way, relate to Israel. It relates to the fact that on most political issues, on most topics, we are unheard in our majority voice, what most of us believe, not everyone, right? But in the vast majority of what we believe in the national political conversation. We have spent, almost 4 years now under an administration that does not really care what we think. And that is incredibly depressing to see. And then you also watch when you make your voice heard or try to on issues of Israel, and you see the exact same thing, particularly as Rabbi Isaac said, on annexation. But I also feel that that there's a takeaway that we sort of miss because we spent so much time in this bunker, right, and so much time being ignored, which is that there is a tremendous amount of power that we have and that we can express, and that can be expressed in just 100 days when there's an American election. And it's time for us to start flipping the switch from thinking of ourselves as sort of a bunker community that is powerless and cannot change the course of international conversation and events to one that has a real voice to be heard and to play. And I think, like, if you put it this way, think of what, 4 years of Trump indulging the absolute worst instincts of every possible party on the ground in Israel-Palestine has done. What that actually does show us, however, is that if you decide to color outside the lines and you decide to start doing and making different decisions, with American leadership, you can really change the conversation. We have a tremendous ability to impact the conversation. Every single Trump move has sort of increased, which is understandable, increased Israeli maximalism. You recognize Israel's Jerusalem's capital without any corresponding moves, right? You recognize the Golan Heights, and then, it's a natural trajectory towards, for the Israeli right to say, let's go for, full annexation. But obviously another American president could do the exact opposite and could push the turbo button on something else. And the conversation I feel that our community needs to start having, and people like IPF and J Street and others have been having, is what are we doing when we hit the ground running if we have the chance to take that power? What are the steps that we can do to do the opposite and to change things? And I'm happy to get into those details later, but I don't want to take up too much now, but I think that that's really the conversation we ought to have now.
Sure.
I'll jump in next. Yeah, that's a great segue to what I was going to talk about. Thank you. I also want to say thank you for the opportunity to IPF, and I'm really glad to be here. It's nice to see people's faces and have a conversation even in this time of, social distancing. So thank you all. In terms of my takeaways, they really have to do with the discourse and the divide in the discourse between Israel and the US. So what was really interesting to me to watch the Israeli discourse around annexation was that there was really a media circus that took place. And you sort of watch the media not know what to say. You watch a lot of people, including in the grantees of NIF. I mean, they knew that they were opposed to annexation, but it was really hard to know what annexation would look like. And it made it really hard to talk about, right? Bibi had floated a number of ideas. Would it be Area C? Would it be just the settlement blocks? There were a lot of different options. And so it made it really hard to talk about. And it was interesting. I mean, I think sort of jumping out from what Yair said, that the thing that happened really distinctly in this conversation in Israel is that annexation and a one-state reality from the right came into view very clearly as what they wanted. In other words, in 2009, Benjamin Netanyahu gave a speech, the Bar Ilan speech, where he said, yeah, we'll have 2 states. It'll be something akin to what everyone's been talking about, maybe a little less, maybe a little, sort of less autonomous, but it'll be 2 states. And they sort of really didn't want to go there in this time. Even as the Trump plan promised 2 states, the Israeli right was not interested in having that conversation. And they sort of said, our values lie with the annexation is right. Our plan is occupation forever. We want to make Israel a full-time occupier. And that made the discourse on the left shift as well. It sort of said, okay, this conversation that we've been having about whether or not the occupation is permanent, well, they're saying it's going to be permanent, so we have to shift. We have to have a conversation about what apartheid would mean and what it actually technically is. And, if this is going to be the future, well, we have to know what that means for actual people on the ground. And they realized that, you know, there's no going back as long as Bibi and his right-wing coalition is in power. And I think that that will be a motivating force the next time there are elections. And Bibi is sort of floating the idea, although he's pulled back in recent days, that there would be elections again. And I think that's a really interesting shift. It's the first time that the right has sort of shown its cards so clearly. The second takeaway is about the kind of disconnect between how the Israeli public and the American Jewish public see or thought about annexation. So it seemed to me that there was a lot of conversation and a lot of sort of, I mean, Rabbi Isaacs, you called this, you know, a potential existential threat. Like, that's how American Jews really felt or feel about the potential for annexation, that this could really, really change the game. And I think they're not wrong. I think that's really true. I think that annexation would shift the reality dramatically. Legally, in terms of Israel's international standing, in terms of what it means for Palestinians and their future. But Israelis consistently ranked annexation as one of their lowest priorities when asked what their priorities were. They did, however, believe that the government was not in line with their priorities. So there was some understanding that, like, you know, what the government's priorities are, which included annexation, are not my priorities. But if what I'm concerned about is not my government annexing, what I'm concerned about is the rate of unemployment. What I'm concerned about is the health system and the safety net that's, like, you know, being swept away from me day to day as we speak. And I think that that was a really interesting sort of disconnect. And the last thing I'll say about that is that even as it didn't feel urgent for Israelis to oppose annexation at the time, they do overall oppose annexation. They really do. The number that that Hebrew University did a social research poll on this, the number is overall Israelis is at 69%. 69% of Israelis oppose. If you call it unilateral annexation, they oppose it. If you call it something else, like a right-wing term, something like extending Israeli sovereignty, the number goes down. But if you ask them about annexation, they oppose it. Interestingly, Israelis think that other Israelis support it more than they do. So 69% oppose it, but Israelis think, even as they oppose it, that about 54% support it, which is just not true. It's about 30-something% that if you ask them straight up, do you support annexation, they do. So that's just another sort of tidbit, and I'll leave off for now.
That's fascinating. You came prepared, obviously, for this panel with those statistics. Something that I've been thinking about is just, and Rav Isaacs, I think you mentioned this in the beginning, about kind of the American Jewish community making its voice heard on this issue. From my analysis, it seems to me like potentially the government of Israel was taken aback by the vociferousness of the opposition to annexation within much of the American Jewish community. Obviously, there are voices in the American Jewish community that were not so loud, or maybe even support some type of annexation. But at the same time, there was clear, very strong opposition from true Zionists and supporters of Israel, which I know, Rav Isaacs, you were talking about. So, as a rabbi, Rabbi Isaacs, what are you seeing what is the discourse like in your community, or kind of in the religious life? How do these conversations around Israel impact the religious life and also the community, your community, in talking about these issues? Is it a microcosm of the national conversation?
So it's interesting you bring up that point, because I serve two different Jewish communities. I serve the Jewish community at Colby College, which is an elite liberal arts campus with students and faculty that are primarily from wealthy, large Jewish communities. So if you look at the Hillel, right, most people are from the New York Metro, DC, Boston, LA, Chicago, generally coming from places where they don't feel alone as Jews, and are largely insulated from the problems that exist in rural and small town America that define the other part of my work of being the rabbi of a small town, rural, largely low income community, right? At least regionally, not in terms of individual members. And so I'm serving two different Jewish communities, and I see that issues of geographic diversity and class, not 100%, but they very much impact broad approaches to the state of Israel more broadly and to Zionism, right? So the kids who grow up in rural Maine that are my congregants, they grow up with often extreme and violent anti-Semitism. It never disappeared for them, the kind of anti-Semitism that a lot of times I heard my parents or grandparents experience that I didn't experience in suburban New Jersey are a daily reality for the kids who grow up in my community. And so when I take those teenagers to Israel, when I take them on a congregational trip, Israel to them is a source of pride and comfort, right? And even though on the whole, they are politically progressive, they are very staunch in their Zionism because they feel an extreme vulnerability in what it means to be a Jew, right? Because in many ways, they live a much more vulnerable life in an area that has been left behind by the global economy and with real anti-Semitism. The experience that I have with Colby Hillel, I think is somewhat different, right? When you grow up at Jewish day schools, when you grow up among a large Jewish community, anti-Semitism is more of a historical memory. Some maybe you're aware of rising anti-Semitism in the Trump administration with white nationalism, but it's something you read about and don't necessarily experience in the same way you do in a low-income or geographically isolated Jewish community. And sometimes my concern is there's a grafting of the experience of being white and privileged in America onto the experience of Israelis. And I think that this is really important because some of the difficult conversations I have with my students at Colby that are really struggling with Israel is that their experience of growing up in this era as American Jews in major metros really has little to no connection to the lived reality of low income, primarily Mizrahi Jews that make up the heart and soul of Israel. That it's very problematic to graft their experience of what it is to be a Jew onto, let's say, somebody in Yerucham or Beersheba or Sderot as a Soviet refugee or as somebody who's experiencing lived realities of terrorism and poverty. So I think the voice of small communities is important because in many ways they connect us to previous generations for whom Zionism was so crucial because their life was one of real vulnerability and risk. I think that voice is left out of discussions of new or millennial voices that are often coming out of elite, wealthy institutions. And I think we need to think very critically about what it means that some of these voices that say that Israel is no longer necessary are coming from the most privileged and insulated Jews and Jewish communities.
Wow, that was a fascinating point regarding Zionism. I think it can lead us to our next conversation or next topic, which is kind of the state of, let's say, American Zionism or how American Jews relate to Zionism. Maybe I'll start with Yair and then go to Elisheva. There's been a lot written about on the state of, how American Jews relate to Zionism, especially millennial Jews. I know, Yair, you've written a little bit about this. And obviously, we have to name the elephant in the room, which is the Peter Beinart piece on Yavne, the kind of his call for looking at or thinking about some type of federation or one state solution, so to speak, for Israel-Palestine. So I guess from your perspective, Yair, and then to Elisheva, what is this, what is the state of American Zionism? Are we entering a new era? Is there, can we ever go back to the way things were? Or is there kind of a new kind of form of Zionism or partnership that we need to think about in today's world?
Yeah, I always find these questions about what do young Jews think about Israel to be they're always very unintentionally monolithic and collapsing, which is what Rabbi Isaacs was getting at, which is that there are many different kinds of young Jews, right? And like say the number of young Jews who have any idea that Peter Beinart's essay exists, right? And the number of young Jews who've ever even thought, with any seriousness about anything like that it discusses, whether one stage or two, or the granular details of what those entail, is vanishingly small. Like that number is much larger, and we are vanishingly small, the people on this call, right? The people on this panel. And it's very important to me as a journalist and as a thinker to always remember that I'm not the center, right? And I am, like, the way I think about things is not always how other people do. There are small, highly motivated cohorts of people who are, perhaps on the bleeding edge left of the American Jewish community, right, who are thinking about things like a one-state solution now, but have been thinking about that for some time. Peter gave voice to it. And then there's also another, edge, which is probably a little bit bigger, which is more orthodox, but not exclusively, which is extremely right-wing and very open to things like annexation and sort of occupation forever, like Shev said. And then there's just like the majority of Jews who just are American Jews and just kind of doing their thing, right? And trying to be and live in this world, which is not in a country that's on fire, right? And for whom Israel is a thing that if you poll them, they will tell you we like it, right? And we are pro-Israel and we have positive feelings about it. And we would happily say, go on a birthright trip and things like this, but they don't have strong, deep, profound views. And they might even be reticent to talk about it because they see the vitriol that gets slung in both directions. And they say, why do I need that? And so like, this is sort of the thing that I see when I went back when we traveled to campuses, right? And I spoke on multiple campuses a month and things, you would see, right, some of the self-selecting students who would come to my events, but then I would then have, lunch in the Hillel, right? And you'd see a different group of students, right? And the sorts of things that are occupying them. And so, I don't like to, I think it's important for us to sort of recognize that there isn't like some strong ideological young Jewish cohort at all. I think actually the big generational turnover in a sense is that a generation ago when Jews felt more vulnerable, when Israel felt more vulnerable, Jews were more proactively pro-Israel, actively so. And then as Jews became and felt more secure, and Israel became and felt more secure, young American Jews thought less about Israel entirely. And part of the issue of trying to get people to care about annexation is that lots of people don't, right? Not just American Jews, but American non-Jews. There's so many things higher on the list. And it's tough when it's such an issue close to your heart. So that's like the one thing I would say. And then I'm trying to think like, should I talk about Peter's essay, which deserves a lot more time than I can give it right now? I'm trying to write a piece about it, right? It's hard. I would just say that, again, trying to take this theme forward of not centering ourselves. There is a tremendous amount of public opinion polling by both Israelis and Palestinians for many, many years, right? That persistently shows that despite all of the roadblocks that exist for a two-state solution and everything that Trump has done to impede it, Palestinians overwhelmingly reject a one-state solution, and so do Israelis. And to the extent that you get people who say, like the 30% who say we support a one-state solution, if you poll them and say, what do you mean by a one-state solution, both Israelis and Palestinians, you get at least half of them saying, oh, I mean expelling the other guys or having them live under permanent apartheid without rights, right? Both Israelis and Palestinians will tell you this if you ask them what they mean by one state. So you end up with like 10 to 15% of people who are actually for a democratic one state. And to my mind, the only solution, whatever my preferences are, and I actually have a lot of sympathy for one state. I did some of my senior thesis about Albert Einstein, right, who was by preference a binationalist, is your solution has to be something that people on the ground want. Because this thing is an incredibly hard and difficult thing to solve, which is an understatement. And you're never going to get it done if you don't have buy-in on the ground. The one-state solution is forever the vanguard of the next popular movement, but the popular movement doesn't materialize. And yet you still get upwards of 40% of Israelis and Palestinians saying, we want a two-state solution. That's where you start, right? And that comes back to the question of power. What do you do if you have power, if American Jewry suddenly has a voice, right, in American policymaking to make that a reality? Not simply hopeful slogans. This is where Peter's right. Not simply hopeful slogans and just going along the same way you've been doing and thinking that it's all just going to work itself out, because it clearly is not, right? What are the active steps? And if I could just take a few seconds more to give a practical example. One practical example.
Very fast.
Very quickly, I wrote on the day that Trump moved the embassy, Israel's embassy to Jerusalem, that the obvious counter move, that if you want to reestablish a direction and narrative towards a two-state solution, you simply take all the rationales for moving the embassy, saying everyone knows this will be the capital of Israel in any arrangement, right? And you declare Jerusalem the future capital of the state of Palestine. And you simply say, everybody knows that too. Don't we all agree? They're never going to give that up, right? Let's move the conversation forward. Let's really take the issue off the table, right? And that just changes the whole direction and trajectory of our public conversation locally and internationally. That's just one example. I know it's being discussed in democratic policy circles. That's something to think about.
Totally. And Shev, maybe I'll repeat the question or a version of the question, because yeah, you're addressed a lot of it, but you working with the new NIF, New Israel Fund, you work with a lot of Israeli civil society organizations. I'm sure you think a lot about the future of Zionism or the future of, what the relationship between American Jews and Israel or Israeli Jews look like. How are you thinking about these issues in this moment?
Yeah. So I would agree with Yair that there's a sort of interesting space that exists between the like people who are engaged on this and the people who are not engaged on this, but generally have feelings. But I will say that I definitely believe that the statistics demonstrate this, right? The vast majority of American Jews in the 70% vote for Democrats. We are a liberal constituency, right? This is a people who does not think that occupation should be permanent and that apartheid should be reality. And so in that sense, there is a very broad consensus that this direction for Israel would be a very, very bad one. And I think that there's a lot of angst about that, in part because of what Rabbi Isaacs said about feeling powerless in some ways to actually have an impact. And also for the reasons that Yair pointed out, given Trump's ascendancy. And, it's worth pointing out that it wasn't just, legacy organizations, unless you want to consider what I'm about to say, legacy organizations that took a stance on annexation. I mean, the reform movement and the conservative movement of Jews, which represents, the majority in America, not the majority in Israel, they came out against annexation. And it was a moment that sort of represented that liberal consensus. And I think it's worth pointing out in terms of how the American Jewish community reacted to annexation. Now, when it comes to the discourse, I'll go back to Yair and agree with him about the sort of smaller contingency that really, really cares and that read Beinart's 8,000 word essay in depth. Obviously, I'm among them. I also happen to have worked for Peter Beinart way back when. So of course I read the essay, but also to Rabbi Isaacs' point, there was so much opining, especially from, and you'll excuse me, gentlemen, from white men on this essay, that it sort of, it made me think that it wasn't really about the content necessarily of the essay, but it was really about a need from certain kinds of American Jews who have been engaged on this issue for a long time and feel really strongly to jump into the conversation. So it felt very much like that was the, that was like a moment for a lot of people to say something that they hadn't had an opportunity to do for a while. So just a commentary on the discourse there. That being said, it's interesting to be at the New Israel Fund at this moment and to be thinking about, how we want to engage American Jews on this issue, on the issue of annexation particularly. And I think that there are a lot of ways forward, but I do think that that is a question that you may ask in the future. So I'm going to hold off on that for now.
Yeah, I'm going to ask that. I just wanted to add to everyone listening, thank you for writing in questions. Remember, you can use the Q&A box to add in your question, which will be turning over to Q&A very soon. So please, if you do have questions, use that feature. So this is the last question that I'll ask the trio before we turn it over to Q&A. And it's really, when we crafted this program, we wanted to ask the question, where do we go from here? I know none of you can predict the future or, are in that business, but as you said, you talked about powerlessness. There is a way of taking back that power, so to speak, or using, as Yair said, using our community's influence and responsibility to lead in this moment. So for each of you, I'd love to hear your thoughts on where do we go from here. Could be in regards to Zionism, annexation, or just the American Jewish community at large, and specifically focusing on the millennial generation. We are now one of the larger generations involved in American Jewish life, and obviously our voices are important. So I would love to hear your thoughts on where do we go from here. Maybe we'll start with Rabbi Isaacs.
Sure. So I look at things from a rabbinical point of view and the perspective of Jewish education. And on one hand, I know that it's very frustrating, especially for young American Jews, to feel as though our opinions aren't taken seriously because we have a certain critical distance and the wisdom that comes from being a minority that I think is very crucial in an ethical discourse in Israel. That said, I also see at the same time, and many Hillel professionals will talk about this openly among ourselves, that the level of Hebraic and Jewish literacy among this generation is the lowest that we've probably ever seen, that there is an inverse relationship between the amount of hard knowledge and Hebraic knowledge that American Jews have, and often the vociferous nature of our opinions. And so I think it's important to say that you need to do work in understanding a foreign country. Like, yeah, we're Jews, but Israel is a foreign country. And in the way that you would in any other society, you need to learn the language in every sense of the word. What are the contours of the debates there? You know, to Shev's point, what's important to Israelis, right? And making the effort to be conversant in Hebrew. And what I've seen in teaching modern Hebrew on a college campus is that even kids coming out of Jewish day schools are much more focused on college prep than they are on Hebrew. So even at the institutions that are designed to make us conversant with Israelis, if you have the privilege to afford a Jewish day school, we're really failing in preparing ourselves to stand up with real credibility and have these conversations. So it's not sexy, but I think we really do need to invest more in knowing Hebrew and understanding Israel on its own terms. I'm going to make two other points, one of which is kind of rabbinic, and the last one I think will be quite controversial. So I'll say, you know, one of the things that I love in studying Hebrew is the wisdom that comes through in the language. And lada'at, to know, right, has two meanings, right? To know something, to know a fact, but also to be intimate with someone. And I think that we need to address our Israeli brothers and sisters from a place of real intimacy. And I'm afraid that that's being lost. I think we're distancing ourselves from Israel as the social pressure of identifying as a Zionist in elite circles increases. And I think we need to increase that intimacy and that sense of knowingness and not decrease it. The last thing I'll say is, look, I came out very strongly. I'm opposed to annexation. I have very strong opinions. But I think we need to be careful about the extent to which we engage in what I see as sort of a colonialist discourse of being part of a powerful empire that thinks we deserve a place at the table because we are from a wealthy country, right? And just because we have opinions and we're well educated, right? And I think there's something that we need to be aware of. The history of the Alliance Française schools, for example, is of French Jews going into lands in the Middle East and North Africa and trying to educate Jews that were more traditional and had a different worldview so that they would be less embarrassing to Jewish folks in France who were enlightened and Western and wealthy. And I know that those of us who are pursuing social justice don't think of ourselves in those terms, but I think we need to be careful the extent to which our internal discomfort around Israel and discussing Israel in elite circles impacts the ways in which we assertively claim that we know what is best for the Israeli population. And I think that if we do want to make a difference, we need to think very critically about having the knowledge to invest in Israeli partners as opposed to using American levers of power to influence internal Israeli and Palestinian concerns.
And Elisheva and Yair, if you could keep your remarks to maybe 1 minute each, and then we'll open
Do my
up.
best. Do you mind if I go first, Yair? All right. So in terms of sort of just jumping off what Rabbi Isaacs just said, that, you know, the bridging of this relationship, the building of intimacy, the creation of a relationship to Israeli partners is actually what NIF does. Right? Part of the mission of this organization is to create bridges between American Jews and their Israeli counterparts and to have an understanding of what's going on for you, what's going on for me. And I think it's a critical piece of this conversation. So thank you for bringing it up. I also just wanted to recommend, this is a conversation after all for, or about at least, millennial Jews. And I think that one thing that's been really hard for many millennial Jews in the last, I would say, decade, has been talking to your parents about Israel. And I just want to recommend that conversation. I think it's worthwhile. It's a thing that that will bring up a lot and will clarify everyone's thinking. So I think that that's like the intergenerational piece is really important. And finally, like again to Rabbi Isaac's point, Israelis, broadly speaking, and you know, we speak in generalizations on these panels, but so it goes, want to be seen or feel, identify as democracy seeking and as peace seeking. We know that. The polling shows it, and it is undoubtedly true, even anecdotally from what we know of our Israeli friends or Israeli family, right? They want to be seen that way. And what we need to do in moments where we know that one direction that the government is pointing them will take them away from peace seeking and democracy seeking, we need to remind them that we are on their side and we want them to be peace seeking and democracy seeking, and that that's where we are, that's where the American Jewish community is, and that we support them in those things. And I think that doing that will go a long way. 1 minute.
That was great.
So I just want to say, like, I think if you're listening to Elisheva and you listen to the thought and the nuance that Rabbi Isaacs gave, and then I think you think about the public discourse we have now, which is so Twitterized because Twitter's greatest power user is the President of the United States, and basically has turned our whole conversation to a platform where, which is allergic to complex thinking. I think one of the things we can think about going forward is how can we have this conversation in the ways that we're having it now, right? Like Shev said, with your parents or like this, right? Where you're actually getting to appreciate the humanity of the other person on the other side and really have a real serious, investment in the topic instead of the sort of thing that we're normally seeing. And I think part of that I hope, right, is when I keep talking about this election, right? Changing the political culture in this country really matters. Changing how we talk about these issues really matters. And so that's one thing I would say. And then the second thing I would say is, to reemphasize, you need Israeli partners on the ground, but Israeli partners look to Americans and American Jews, especially Americans they see as friends, for guidance about what actually is the right path and what is the wrong path. And there are ways to do that. You shouldn't be doing it in a way that's condescending or cruel or entitled. But when someone say, like, for example, to pull it out of hat, Joe Biden shows up to Israel and says something, they don't have a negative association with that guy, right? And that matters. And we should be trying to leverage the fact that we are seen as friends. And many of us have strong, positive relationships with many people in the Israeli community to make that case, right? And I think, honestly, whether you're arguing for one state or two states or particular policies, these articles should be happening in Hebrew, right? And part of the issue is sometimes we're talking to ourselves, right? And the more we can talk to each other, right, even when it's hard, the better off we're probably going to be.
And that feeds into Rabbi Isaac's point about Hebrew and having that education, which is I myself do not. So that's a really good point. So we're turning over to audience Q&A. I think I'm going to start out with Rabbi Isaacs. The question is regarding basically, do American Jews have the right or the ability to influence or try to push Israel towards a two-state solution if American Jews do not live in Israel? So it's kind of this classic question of what is our role in this conversation when we don't necessarily live there? And then I'm going to have one more for Elisheva regarding, it's from Stuart Gershon, and he wrote, occupation is the disease. With creeping annexation continuing without de facto annexation, how do we turn the conversation back around to first principles around ending the occupation? So I'll start out with those, and then we can get a question for you.
So thank you for that question. I think it's really important. I think whether or not we have the right to have an opinion, we all do, right? I mean, so saying that people don't have the right to an opinion, I think is somewhat ridiculous. I think we have a vested interest in the future of Israel. And I do think that annexation will affect the global Jewish community. Maybe not equally, but it will very much impact my work as a rabbi if annexation goes forward, because I think there will be a generation of younger Jews that will distance themselves more broadly from the Jewish community as a result. My larger point is the way in which we express our opinions, our investments, and the way in which we choose to influence. And I just believe that profoundly, in the same way that American Jewish World Service believes in creating change in the global South through investing in grassroots nonprofits, I think, like NIF, we should have the same approach, right? That the people that need to be empowered and need to be centered if we are going to create a better future for Israel and a future Palestinian state have to be Israelis and Palestinians, right? Both in terms of our investment, our focus, and we can still have opinions while giving necessary kavod to Palestinians and Israelis who have on-the-ground experience of living this conflict.
again, to just jump right in after that, like to answer the question of how do we get back to first principles, the way that I do it as a communications professional, and in general, I think the most compelling way to talk about it is to talk about what will happen to people, right? So if you think about what happens under occupation today, the sort of processes and mechanisms of dispossession, of containment, and of oppression that happen to Palestinians basically on a day-to-day, what we know about annexation is that that will only double down. So I'll give you one example, right? Palestinians who live in Area C, which is an area that Benjamin Netanyahu had discussed in one iteration, right, annexing, those Palestinians are registered through a complex, for complex reasons, not where they live, but they are actually usually registered in the closest large city that is in Area A. So if Israel were to annex that territory, it would annex the land, but it would not annex the people on it. And the people on it would legally find themselves as foreign aliens on the land that they actually live on, where they live. So to think about sort of what the mechanisms of occupation are, how much worse they would get if Israel were to annex, I think is the way to have that conversation.
Gotcha, thank you. So for your ear, we have a question from Robert Kantowitz, and he's basically asking in a rather long phrase question, but his question is really, when you talk about who has the ear of the current administration, he points out that Orthodox Jews, for maybe one of the first times in U.S. history, really do have some type of influence or sway with the White House. When you think about this, historically, or like when you talk to the question about who has influence, how does that like resonate with you in this political moment with this current administration?
So hey, I'll tell you a secret. It's not really a secret. I'm an Orthodox Jew. My dad's a modern Orthodox rabbi. And so this is one of the reasons why I feel when people sort of collapse sort of groups into monoliths, we often lose the diversity of our voices. And I was very careful to say that the majority of the Jewish community has a particular voice, right? And that includes a portion of the Orthodox community, but by no means all. There's also a portion of the Orthodox community and the ultra-Orthodox community that is non-Zionist or even anti-Zionist, right? You have real diversity. But the overall, and that's what we're having this conversation from, and that's where this conversation comes from. And I think it's fair. I think Jews are right to say that like the majority voice of our voice should be heard. Part of the issue with the Trump administration is that it picks very, very, not just from the Jewish community, it picks very specific voices to listen to in minority communities, regardless of what the broader community is saying, right? So he'll pick his diamond and silk and like bring them to the White House, to give an example, those of you who are familiar with this. He has these sorts of people that he deputizes. I reported from the Republican National Convention when he was nominated on the ground, and they just had a parade of the Black for Trump, the Hispanic for Trump, right? This is literally what they called them, right? And it's not, and this is, by the way, no president should do that, right? And it also goes the other way. You should listen to the majority voice and also give a respectful hearing to the minority voices. And I feel like that's sort of what's missing right now, whereas only a very small slice of the community is being heard, right? And the rest of the community is being ignored. I'm not calling for another president to then ignore the community that's being heard. I'm saying that we should have them all at the table. And by the way, those Orthodox organizations were invited to the White House and were at the table. People don't realize this, during the Obama administration, they did get heard. They weren't always heard in the ways that I would necessarily, sometimes they were on religious liberty. I'm closer to them, right? Things like that. It's complicated. Yeah, there's one other thing. I'll leave it at that. I do have something that I feel is coming up in the questions that I'm just seeing. There's a lot of questions about the viability of a two-state solution. I don't know if
or maybe you can address that really briefly.
Yeah, so people reasonably ask, after 4 years of Trump, people have this notion that the two-state solution is not viable. This word gets thrown out there. And they make this claim, well, it's because settlements have, expanded, so they feel in their understanding of where, the facts on the ground land. This is actually, ironically, a settler right-wing talking point that was created by the settlers to say that if we just put a few settlements here and there in the West Bank that comprise, a single-digit percent, like less than 5% of the West Bank, right, that we can foreclose a two-state solution because we have created facts on the ground that make it dividing the land impossible. But what progressive groups and international outsiders have pointed out, for example, I think the think tank Elisheva worked at, excellent progressive think tank called Molad, they wrote about this. They said, so there's some small little like caravans and little settlements, right, in areas that are really hard to get into Israel that you couldn't possibly do anything other than have to say remove those people, which would be really hard. They said you don't need to do that. You just redraw the line on the land, and then those people are now a Jewish minority in the state of Palestine, just as there is a large Palestinian minority in the state of Israel, and the problem is solved. You do not have to accept the settler rights framing of this issue. And interestingly, in Peter Beinart's essay, he mentions this point. And an Israeli group that advocates it called One Land for All. The thing he doesn't mention is that that group is a pro-two-state solution group, and they advocate this because they think that it is a way to get to the two-state solution. And if you think, well, yeah, that sounds far-fetched. Are they really, the Palestinians really going to coexist with these small groups of, tens of thousands of Jews as a minority? After all, they view them as interlopers who took their land. Right? So wait till I tell you about the alternative option, which is that everyone will live in the same land with the people they each view as interlopers who took their land. Right? If you think that what I'm telling you is a heavy lift, well, almost always those obstacles are fivefold for a one-state solution, which is why I emphasize, and I think IPF is right to emphasize, that if we're thinking about what to do in the next 4 years, right, we should be thinking about the two-state solution and how we can change the direction of the conversation on that before jumping to something else.
I completely agree. Yeah, we'll get to you. So you want to respond really fast, and then we'll do final round.
Sure. So this is where it gets fun for me, because I love disagreeing with Yair. So it's not that I actually ultimately disagree necessarily. It's just that I take issue with some of the ways that you frame things. So you said people understandably ask the question of the viability of the two-state solution 4 years after Trump. It's not 4 years after Trump. It's 50 plus years after occupation, right? And this is actually what's at issue. And there's very, very good reason to understand why people would feel this way. The graph that has for many, many years demonstrated how people feel about two states is like this, right? We want two states, we want two states. But the graph that shows, if people think it's possible is actually like this. People just keep on thinking that it's less and less possible. And there's good reason for that, because, 20 years ago, there were not 650,000 settlers living in the West Bank. And now there are. And it's really hard to see, in part because of the settler strategy, how you create a contiguous Palestinian state as a result. Now, again, I am not coming down one state, two state. I'm just saying that line of thinking makes a lot of sense. And I'll also take issue with one other thing, which is that the argument that the think tank that I worked for made was not just redraw the line. It was turn off the tap. In other words, there are subsidies that the Israeli government has sent across the Green Line for years and years and years. And the way that you get people to stop living there is to stop supplying them with state stuff, including subsidized transportation, subsidized electricity, subsidized housing in certain cases. So it's a bigger ask in a really serious way than just redraw the line. It's
thinking about
people out actually by stopping to support or subsidize their life over there. So I'll
that's the next 4 years, right? Your question is, what are the policies that if you're an American government that you have to say, we're going to spend our political capital on saying this is what we want to see? How many times have you heard what Elisheva just said in a public policy conversation in the United States, including by people who support two states and are very left-wing on the issue? It's not something that gets raised. It is, practically speaking, very important. So I'm not, I don't actually disagree with that at all.
Rabbi Isaacs, if you want to conclude with a final minute of your thoughts, is totally optional, but as a rabbi, I thought you'd want to have the last word here.
That's true, although you should never trust a rabbi with a limited time frame. But I would like to conclude actually by saying two things. First is thank you so much to the Israel Policy Forum. I think I, like a lot of highly engaged young American Jews, failed to find my home in the American Jewish community until the Israel Policy Forum really created an organization that represented not just right-wing or left-wing or two states or, the policy is even less important than I think the quality of the discussion, to create a space where we can balance competing values and understand that the facts on the ground are complicated, right? And that it does a disservice to everyone to flatten conversations and create straw men in order to burnish our own reputations or to try and solve problems that often we have a shallow understanding thereof. So thank you to the Israel Policy Forum and to my co-panelists for elevating the discussion, because I think we really need more of that. And I think that that's really where I want to leave it. And I hope that our values can be successfully integrated into Israeli policy in the future in a way that's humble, that's effective, and that creates the best reality on the ground for Palestinians and Israelis alike.
Yes, I'm into that, and not just Israeli policy, American foreign policy, as that's what Israel Policy Forum as an organization seeks to shape, and as you said, elevate the discourse and shape the conversation on these important issues regarding the viability and achievement of two states. So to wrap things up, thank you so much to all of our panelists, Rabbi Isaacs, Elisheva Goldberg, Yair Rosenberg. This was an excellent conversation. I'm so honored to being able to have a small piece within this, and just to have a few shout outs and reminders for those listening in regarding IPF Atid and Israel Policy Forum. As we've heard today, leaders in our civil society and across the American Jewish community can responsibly guide our communities forward, including young people, by injecting notions of pragmatism and diversity of thought into these difficult conversations. With this in mind, as Susie mentioned in the beginning, we're happy to be accepting applications for the 2020 IPF Atid Charles Bronfman Conveners Program, which Rabbi Isaacs is an alumna of. This leadership development and cohort building experience trains, connects, and empowers 25 young professionals from across North America to host programs and initiatives like this one for their own networks. Please visit Israel Policy Forum website and IPF Atid's homepage for more information. We will also distribute a nomination form in case you may want to invite or you'd like to refer leaders our way. Next week, Israel Policy Forum's Tuesday webinar will take place at the same time, 2 p.m. Eastern Time on August 4th. Stay tuned for additional details on which expert guest speaker will be joining us. Remember, if it's a Tuesday, it's an IPF webinar. In addition, I'm happy to invite young professionals to join in an upcoming related program. On August 19th, we will be, seems far away from now, but we'll be here before you know it. We will be convening a program featuring breakout rooms and facilitators without any pre-assigned speakers. So participating attendees, just like yourself, can join in the discussion and unpack the topics we brought up today. We'd love to hear from you and have you join. You can follow along with Israel Policy Forum and all major social media channels, including through our Annexation Watch online project. To stay a part of the young professional community of IPF Atid, search for us on Facebook and Instagram to join the conversation. Lastly, thank you deeply to all those currently supporting Israel Policy Forum. Your support is critical to our continued success in expanding our reach. I invite you to please consider contributing to Israel Policy Forum to keep our hope and vision alive for a Jewish, democratic, and secure Israel. Have a great rest of your afternoon, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.